honored guests, friends, it is truly a pleasure to be here tonight to introduce UNB's 2014 Eaton Lecturer. Dr. Jack L. Granatstein is one of this country's foremost historians. With more than 70 titles to his credit, including the Oxford Companion to Canadian Military History, he has been described as the most prolific Canadian historian of his generation. However, for many Canadians, Jack Granatstein is best known for his television and radio work. He has provided historical commentary for CBC TV's coverage of numerous commemorative anniversaries, including the 90th anniversary of Vimy Ridge, as well as for Remembrance Day ceremonies alongside Peter Mansbridge. A Toronto native, Dr. Granatstein attended Le Collège Militaire Royal de Saint-Jean and earned a BA at the Royal Military College, an MA at the University of Toronto, and a PhD at Duke University. He served in the Canadian Army from 1956 to 1966 and then joined the History Department at York University in Toronto, where, after taking early retirement in 1995, he is a Distinguished Research Professor of History Emeritus. An Officer of the Order of Canada since 1996, his many awards and honors also include 7 honorary doctorates. In 2008, the Conference of Defense Associations awarded Dr. Granatstein its 75th anniversary book prize as the author deemed to have made the most significant positive contribution to the general public's understanding of Canadian foreign policy, national security, and defense during the past quarter century. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jack Granatstein, who will deliver the lecture, Canada's 100 Days, 1918, Why Don't Canadians Know About Their Greatest Victories? Dr. Granatstein.
Thank you very much. I'm really very pleased to give this Eaton lecture on behalf of the Gregg Center for the Study of War and Society. Mark Milner and his colleagues have made the Gregg Center the leading place to study war and society in all of Eastern Canada, past and present. The Army is a special focus, and because of Mark's expertise on the Royal Canadian Navy, the Navy is also part of his mandate. It's a particular pleasure to give this lecture sponsored by Fred Eaton. I served on the Board of Trustees of the Canadian Museum of Civilization Corporation in Ottawa with Fred for 5 years, as we tried with some limited success to make it a national museum for all Canadians. The War Museum is that. The Canadian Museum of Civilization in its new guise as the Canadian Museum of History will become that. Now I want to talk about the 100 Days and begin by saying that about 20 years ago, just about the time I went to the Canadian War Museum as director and CEO, I wrote a little book called Who Killed Canadian History, in which I lamented how little Canadians knew of their past, not least their military past. At that time, the Dominion Institute was doing surveys that showed that students knew nothing about World War I or World War II, couldn't identify the Allies or the enemies, didn't know who Mackenzie King was, and most of them thought Vimy was in Asia somewhere. At the War Museum, when I arrived in 1998, it was in a state of complete physical and historical decay in the former National Archives building. I made it a condition of my going to the War Museum that I could hire 3 first-rate historians. And the historians I hired, as their first task, went through the museum at my request, my demand, and produced a 35-page memorandum of the factual errors, which we proceeded to correct. Now there's a new building on Vimy Place in the Le Breton Flats of Ottawa, and it's superb. It's the best historical museum in Canada. But 20 years later, what's changed? The War Museum has changed. That's good. Not much has changed in the teaching and study of history in our high schools. Canadian history is still taught in this province with only one compulsory course on 20th century Canada. My granddaughter is in grade 10 at this point and taking this course, and I guess I'll hear what it's all about. We also have the media telling us a great deal about the First World War as the centenary gets underway. Extensive coverage in the National Post, in the Globe and Mail, in all the local papers. And I look at it with a little bit of dismay because it seems to me that all it really covers is Vimy, Vimy, Vimy. Vimy, where the great war memorial, the greatest war memorial anywhere in my view, rises above the Douai Plain. Vimy was important. It was a great victory that April Easter Monday in 1917. It was the first time that 4 Canadian divisions fought together, and they took a heavily defended German position as part of a larger British attack on the Arras front. The Corps was commanded, not as most Canadians think, by Arthur Currie, but by British Lieutenant General Sir Julian Byng. Currie commanded the 1st Canadian Division. Currie contributed to the plan, but it was not a Canadian plan. It was a plan that was made by Byng and his staff officers, almost all of whom were British officers seconded to the Canadian Corps. The Canadian Corps itself was not really Canadian. More than 60% of the men in the ranks of the Canadian Corps were born in the United Kingdom. They had immigrated to Canada before the war, and they joined up because it was a way to get home and a way to fight for the empire and the crown. Most important, despite what most Canadians think, Vimy didn't win the war. It didn't speed the German defeat. It didn't do anything very much except move the Germans' line back a few miles. It did have important consequences. It was terrific for Allied morale at a time when there were very few victories for the Allies. It was terrific for Canadian morale at home. Canadians looked at the headlines in the New York Times and the Times of London and said, "Canadians take Vimy," and they felt a surge of national pride. It was important for the men of the Canadian Corps. Many of them felt that for the first time they became Canadian. It made them into an elite formation, considered as early as April 1917 to be one of the very best British corps in the British Expeditionary Force. They were the Canadian Corps, and it meant something to be in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Division. But the overall effect of this victory on the course of the war was really minimal. So if we ask why Canadians know so little about World War I, and frankly World War II as well, I would argue it's because the shadow of Vimy has blotted out everything else. The great monument blocks out the sun from shining on other subjects, on other battles, other victories. And I saw this especially when I began to look at the 100 Days. The 100 Days were a decisive series of battles that began on August the 8th, 1918, and ended with the armistice, really the German surrender, on November 11th, 1918. In those battles, the Canadian Corps played the greatest role that any Canadian army in any war we have fought has ever played. And yet the extraordinary thing is that Canadians know nothing about it at all. I've talked about it in a number of venues, and afterwards people come up and say, I didn't know about that. Nobody does. It's essentially disappeared from the public consciousness because Vimy takes all the light away from it. Moreover, in the 100 days, the Canadian Corps was manned for the first time in the war by a majority of Canadians, men born in Canada. It was commanded by a Canadian, Sir Arthur Currie. It was staffed by Canadian staff officers. And the Canadian Corps did extraordinary things. These were ordinary men doing extraordinary things in a time of great crisis. At Amiens, on August the 8th, the Canadians, who had moved to Amiens in great secrecy, imagine moving 100,000 men, thousands of horses, trucks, guns, in secrecy, some 60 miles to the south. And the Germans didn't know they had come to Amiens because by August 1918, the Germans had come to expect that when the Canadians turned up on the line, something was going to happen. With British and Australian troops on each flank, with French troops over to the right, the Canadians smashed through the German line and advanced 8 miles in one day. In terms of Great War battles, that was extraordinary. Most advances in the First World War seemed to be limited to a few hundred yards. It was General Erich Ludendorff, the chief planner in the Kaiser's army on the Western Front, said was the black day of the German army in the war. After that battle, after that victory, and after suffering a lot of casualties, the Canadians moved back to the Arras front. And at the end of August and the first few days of September, the Canadian Corps cracked the extension of the Hindenburg Line, the main German defenses in northern France, called the Drocourt-Quéant Line. Later in the month of September, the Canadians crossed the Canal du Nord, arguably the greatest Canadian battle ever, certainly Arthur Currie's masterpiece, and certainly just about the last formidable German defenses on the Western Front. As the President said a few moments ago, it was there that Milton Gregg won his Victoria Cross. He was a New Brunswick school teacher who, by 1918, had run a military cross and bar, in other words, 2 military crosses, for his courage in action. And after his platoon in the Royal Canadian Regiment crossed the Canal du Nord, they were clearing parts of the Marcoing line. Gregg found his platoon, he was a lieutenant and a platoon commander, he found his platoon was held up by German barbed wire. He found a hole in the wire, crawled through, forced an enemy trench, threw grenades to take out machine gun posts. He went back to the rear to get more grenades to throw. He reorganized his men despite wounds to hold the trench they'd taken. He was wounded 3 times, and he was personally said to have killed or wounded 11 Germans and taken 25 men prisoner and knocked out 12 machine guns. This is a mild New Brunswick school teacher, an ordinary man in extraordinary times. And the center named after him carries on his good work. After the Canal du Nord, after more heavy fighting, the Canadians reached Cambrai, the main center of the German supply lines in northern France, and they took it on 9 October. It was followed by the liberation of Valenciennes on November the 1st, and then the pursuit to Mons, where the British had first met the German army in August 1914. It's liberated by the Canadians on November 11th, 1918, the day the armistice comes into effect. This is the very pinnacle of Canadian arms. And I'm not going to trace the battles. I want to talk about why the Canadian Corps was so effective. Why did it succeed? What was it that made these 4 divisions so potent? First thing, in my view, is that the Canadian Corps stayed together. In the British Expeditionary Force, divisions could be moved around from corps to corps. The Canadian Corps stayed together. They knew who was beside them, they knew who the commanders were, they knew that they could count on the people on their flanks to do the job they were given. Moreover, and hugely important, the Canadian Corps was at full strength in August 1918. Most British divisions, by that point, had scraped the bottom of the barrel. The Canadian Corps was at full strength. Indeed, it was above strength because Arthur Currie, the commander, had added 100 extra men to each of the 48 battalions in the Canadian Corps. He had a reinforcement stream that worked, and he had conscripts, men signed up under the Military Service Act beginning in January 1918, who had been trained and who had reached France in increasing numbers starting in May 1918. Up to 45% of the reinforcements in some battalions were conscripts. They don't get any credit. They tend to be brushed aside in accounts of the history of the 100 Days, but they made a critical difference. Currie had also refused, he could play the national commander card, he had refused to do what the British were doing. They were reducing their brigades from 4 battalions to 3, in effect from 4,000 men in round numbers to 3,000. Canadian brigades had 4 battalions. And Canadian divisions, because of Currie's reinforcements and the 100 extra men he'd put in, had 50% more infantry than British divisions. The Corps also had more artillery. We had had a 5th Division sitting in England for the last couple of years. It couldn't come to France because its commander was Sam Hughes' son, Garnet Hughes, and Currie did not think Garnet Hughes was fit to command a division in the field. He refused to have it, and finally, in 1918, the division was broken up to be used as reinforcements. But Currie kept its artillery regiments together, and he brought them to France to add to the Canadian Corps' firepower. In addition, the Corps' Commander Royal Artillery, as he was called, could direct the fire of his guns centrally, unlike British corps. So you could have the Canadians fire all of the artillery from, in effect, 5 divisions on a single target at the direction of the Corps' artillery commander. And the Canadians also used more gas than anybody else. We like to think that only the Germans used gas, the Canadians used tons of gas, and they used more in France than any other army for a good part of the war. The other weapon that was critical was machine guns. The Canadians had a machine gun battalion in each division, 96 guns. They had more men than British machine gun units. They were increasing their machine gun strength while the British divisions were reducing theirs. The Canadians in 1918 had 1 machine gun for every 13 men. The British had 1 machine gun for every 61 men, a huge difference. Now, to compare that to early in the war, when the power of the machine gun had not yet been fully realized, in 1914, a Canadian battalion had 2 machine guns. In 1915, it had 4. By 1918, if 1 for every 13 men is the rule, it's about 80 machine guns, 70 machine guns for each battalion. The Corps also had more engineers. Currie understood that on the conditions of a Great War battlefield, where artillery chewed up the ground, where it always seemed to be muddy and raining, where sometimes in Flanders the water table was very high, you needed engineers to get your troops across the battlefield, to build the bridges, to build the railways that could move supplies forward, to build the duck boards that let you get across the muddy ground. The Canadians had more engineers, an engineer brigade of 3 battalions and a bridging section in each division. And they had other specialized units. And they had enough personnel that the engineering units could do the work instead of going out and dragging poor bloody infantry out of the trenches to dig when they should be resting. The Corps also had more trucks, 100 more trucks than a British Corps. And Currie understood that the drivers had to be fit because the roads were terrible. It was hard work driving for long hours every day. You had to help unload and load, and he wanted only A-category men, fit men, to drive his trucks. The Corps also had its own mobile force, 2 motor machine gun brigades. That one of the vehicles the motor machine gun brigades used is in the Canadian War Museum. This was, in effect, the invention of the armored car. They could do indirect fire, they could do reconnaissance, they gave mobility, they could scout. They were an added plus for the Canadian Corps. And the Corps was well led, well staffed. The staff planners, now all but 1 or 2 Canadians, these were the men who'd spent weeks preparing the 12-inch thick tactical and administrative orders for the attack on Vimy Ridge in April 1917. Now they were skilled. Now they could devise complicated plans in days and do so without the paper burden that had previously been necessary. Major Morris Pope, who in the Second World War was Mackenzie King's military advisor as a lieutenant general, in 1918 was a staff officer at the 4th Canadian Division's headquarters. He noted in September 1918 that Vimy had taken months of preparation. 4 days ago, he said of the attack on the Drocourt-Quéant line, "I knew nothing of this affair, and the job is at the very least of equal magnitude." The staff work now was quick, prompt, and effective. The planners interpreted the intelligence reports, and they prepared the plans to fit what they knew, what the Allied High Command wanted. General Currie's Corps headquarters drew up the overall attack plan, laying down the tasks for each of the Corps' 4 divisions. At the divisions, plans were drawn up, adjusted to fit each of the brigades, and the brigade staff passed the orders down to the battalions. At Amiens, on August the 8th, for example, the 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade issued a 2-page order for the attack. 2 pages. In a matter of hours, Currie's orders could reach Private Bloggs and No. 3 Platoon of C Company of the Umpty-Umph Battalion, in a simplified form, to be sure, but they would be accompanied by air photographs and maps showing the objective that the troops were to take. The Canadian Corps, its commanders, its staff officers, and its soldiers alike were now a skilled, experienced team. Most of them Canadians, men who had learned their jobs by watching British Army professionals at Corps, Division, and Brigade headquarters and by going through staff courses. It's also a younger army. At the beginning of the war, when the Canadians go into Ypres in 1915, April 1915, battalion commanders were ordinarily in their late 40s or early 50s. By 1918, they were now men in their late 20s or early 30s. And they had a battle doctrine. The Corps had trained for open warfare since May 1918. They'd learned how to use tanks, artillery, and aircraft to support infantry attacks. Artillery was now accurate, much more so than it had been, intense, and then it was followed by quick attacks through soft spots, using infiltration, fire and movement, and supported by the tanks and the air and the aircraft. At Amiens, the infantry battalions attacked on a front of 1,000 yards, double that of 1917. You weren't crammed together, now you were spread out. The main body of men were preceded by sections of scouts or skirmishers who located the enemy strong points, pointed them out to the tanks to eliminate them so the men could filter through the enemy line rather than taking them all on at once. We were emulating the Germans' stormtrooper tactics that had worked so effectively in the great German offensives of March to June 1918. If resistance could not be evaded, then troops employed fire and movement, half the platoon rushing forward with its Lewis machine gun, frequently fired from the hip, while using the Lewis gun of the other half of the platoon and rifle grenades to provide covering fire. Where necessary, artillery, tanks, and aircraft could take out serious resistance. If this sounds a bit like World War II, it should. The Canadians were very much forerunners of tactics in the Second World War. Moreover, commanders, battalion commanders, had orders not to worry about their flanks. They had orders to keep the advance going. Earlier doctrine had said that a commanding officer should remain at his headquarters until the objective had been taken. Not now. Speed was the essence of the new doctrine. And the artillery barrage at Amiens, for example, moved at a pace of 100 yards every 2 minutes and was not preceded by an artillery barrage so as to keep surprise. A year earlier, the Canadian barrage had moved 100 yards in 8 minutes, so you'd speeded everything up dramatically. In effect, the Canadian Corps, to use Lieutenant Colonel Shane Schreiber's phrase, became the shock troops of the British Empire. Well, why? Why were the Canadians used as shock troops? First and most important, because it was an excellent, well-led formation with much punch and a terrific record of success. That mattered, of course. Second, General Currie wanted his corps to do the big things, to fight and win big battles. Canadian nationalism had grown very strong during the war, and Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden and Currie both understood that a different, stronger Canada had to emerge from the war. Third, the Canadian Corps, as I said, was at or near full strength, with its reinforcements coming forward in a steady stream to replace casualties. But the final point, somewhat less palatable, is that British casualties in the 4 years of war had been terrible. Catastrophes like the Somme and Passchendaele swallowing hundreds of thousands of men. The politicians in Whitehall inevitably felt the heat. And Field Marshal Douglas Haig, at the headquarters of the British Expeditionary Force, came to understand that repetitions of such losses for no discernible strategic purpose would mean his head. Canadian casualties, however, mattered much less to London and, frankly, much less to Haig. They were a Canadian political problem, not Haig's, not Prime Minister David Lloyd George's in London. I don't want to make too much of this, but it was the unpleasant reality. Thus, it was the Canadian Corps that would tackle the Drocourt-Quéant line, the Canal du Nord, and Cambrai, and suffer casualties in doing so. But above all, what the Canadian Corps had was its commander, Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Currie. He was unloved by the Canadian troops. He was a fat, pear-shaped man, shy, didn't look the part of a soldier. Douglas Haig may have had no brain, but he looked like a soldier. Arthur Currie had a very good brain. He didn't look much like a soldier. He probably, although I've never heard a recording of him, he probably also had a squeaky voice. He suffered from the Minister of Militia and Defense in Canada, Sir Sam Hughes, who stayed as minister until Borden fired him at the end of 1916. Hughes was the father of Garnet Hughes, who, as I mentioned, Currie would not have commanded division at the front. That was enough to put Currie in his bad books. But Currie also had a past. He, before the war, had been a Victoria, British Columbia property speculator who found himself going broke in a crash in 1913. He was also at that time the commanding officer of a new Highland battalion that was being raised in Victoria. And he'd been given by the government $10,000 to buy the kilts and sporrans and skein-doos and all the other stuff that a Highland regiment seems to require. He stole the money to pay his debts. $10,000 doesn't sound like much. Today, still substantial, but in 1914, it was $250,000 in today's dollars. He stole that money to cover his debts, and he thought he had someone, when he went off to Valcartier and overseas, thought he had someone who would pay it back for him. It didn't happen. And that hung over his head through most of the war until some of his well-off senior commanders paid off the debt for him. But if Currie had that one sin, stealing that $10,000, he was a man of high principle and great moral courage. To refuse to give Hughes' son a division in the field took enormous guts. Currie believed in the meritocracy of the battlefield, and he resisted patronage. The Canadians, for the first 2 years of the war, had been seen as a patronage army, staffed by friends of Sam Hughes, friends of the Conservative Party. Currie commanded a brigade at Eaton in April 1915, and he did well, though he made one foolish mistake, going to the rear to try to bring up reinforcements, to give extra men for his hard-pressed battalions. But he went back with the reinforcements and used them to hold the line as long as it was possible. He got the 1st Division when the Canadian Corps was formed in late 1915, 2 divisions at that point. And he impressed General Byng, the Corps' commander from mid-1916, because he could fight and learn and change his tactics to suit the conditions as he found them. He played a substantial role in shaping the Corps' organization and tactics for Vimy in April 1917. He had been sent by Byng to Verdun to study French tactics, and he brought back some of the lessons that the Canadians and other British units were incorporating from what the French had gone through. And when Byng is promoted after Vimy to take command of an army, Currie is made Corps commander in June 1917. He showed his good sense and moral courage almost immediately. He was to take Hill 70 in the town of Lens, just a few miles from Vimy. If you're on top of Vimy Ridge, you can see the hills, really slag heaps, and you can see the steel town of Lens quite clearly. The British told him to take the town. Currie thought it made no sense to get involved in a house-clearing battle. That would cause casualties, destroy the town, do nothing. Why not take Hill 70 and one other key hill? Reinforce it quickly. Get your machine guns, your wire, your artillery moved up quickly, and then make the Germans do what their doctrine said they had to do, counterattack. Germans always counterattacked relentlessly. And if you were prepared for it, you could, as Currie's men did at Hill 70, you could wreak terrible damage on them. Several German divisions are effectively wiped out trying to attack Currie's position atop Hill 70. He did this again, standing up for what he knew to be right, in September 1918 at the Canal du Nord. He wanted to send his entire corps of 4 divisions through a narrow, dry section of an incomplete canal. Send them through and then have them fan out. That required that you concentrate 4 divisions in a small area on the western bank of the canal. If the Germans learned where you were going and what you were planning, artillery, gas, counterattacks could destroy you. The British, at the First Army, under which the Canadian Corps served, and at British Expeditionary Force headquarters, argued with Currie. It's too dangerous, don't do it. But Currie persisted, even though he was told that if he failed, he'd be relieved of his command and sent back to Canada. It worked. It was his single best battle. It required great courage to insist in the face of superior officers that he knew best. And he did. And he used his role as, in effect, a National Army commander to keep the Canadians together, to resist British efforts to reorganize, and even to argue against creating an army of 2 Canadian corps. Currie would have been promoted to full general if he'd agreed with that, but he thought it made no sense. The Canadian Corps of 4 divisions fought very well. If you made the divisions smaller and weaker to create 2 more divisions, to create 2 corps of 3 divisions each, all you would do is increase the number of staff officers, the amount of tail to serve an equivalent number of teeth. He didn't think that made any sense. He resisted being promoted because it would reduce, in his view, the efficiency of his fighting men. And though few ever mention this, Currie was a ruthless fighter. He put it this way in an address in 1919 in Toronto to the Empire Club. "We were counterattacked by 8 German divisions on October the 1st, he said, 2 of which were fresh. Do you realize that meant 50 or 60,000 Germans, all quite willing to die, coming right at us, determined to kill everyone if they could get through. And we were determined that we would kill every one of them rather than let them get through. On that day, we fired 7,000 tons of ammunition into them. No wonder," he said, "the ammunition factories of Canada were kept busy. It was fired to kill. If they got close to us and escaped the artillery, we tried to shoot them with rifles, kill them with machine guns. If they came on, as they were quite willing to do, we were ready to stick the bayonet into them. I want you to understand what war is, and you cannot have war without the inevitable price." Can you imagine a Canadian commander in this day and age saying anything similar? Maybe the only one who might have was Rick Hillier, but I don't think anybody else would have. In that same speech in Toronto, Currie said, "We believed that the only way to win wars was by fighting, so we prepared attacks on every front. We tried to make the Germans' life miserable. We gassed him on every opportunity, and on one occasion, 90% of the gas in France was being thrown at the Boche by the Canadians. We never forgot that gas at Ypres, and we never let him forget it either. We gassed him on every conceivable occasion, and if we could have killed the whole German army by gas, we would gladly have done so." Currie's Canadian Corps suffered terrible casualties. The casualties in that war are almost unthinkable. 68,656 dead, 176,000 wounded or injured, a total of 245,000 casualties. That death roll included 51,700 members of the Canadian Expeditionary Force killed in action, and 7,800 who died of disease. In all, 422,000 men and 2,400 women, almost all nursing sisters, served overseas. But some of them stayed in England for their entire time out of Canada. In other words, to get overseas, to England or France, was to have a 58% chance of being killed or wounded. And if you deduct the number who didn't get to France from England, that percentage is substantially higher. To carry this further, since at least 8 in 10 casualties fell on the infantry, an infantryman's chance of surviving the war without being wounded were minuscule. And most of those killed, as Battery Sergeant Major Brooke Claxton, later Louis Saint Laurent's defense minister, wrote, most of those men died in ways that were mean, mechanical, and drab. There was no heat of battle, none of the storybook stuff, just horribly inhuman. In the 100 days, August 8th to November 11th, 1918, the Canadian Corps sustained 45,800 killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. That's 18.7%, or almost 1 in 5 of all the Canadian casualties in the 4 years of war. A staggering testimony to the fierceness of the fighting the Corps engaged in from Amiens to the Drocourt-Quéant line, from the Canal du Nord to Cambrai to Valenciennes, and in the pursuit to Mons. The most men who died or were killed on a single day during the 100 days were the 960 who fell on September the 1st. The total casualties, as always, most falling on the infantry, almost equaled the roughly 48,000 men in the 48 battalions of the Canadian Corps when they were at full strength. But against this, we have to set the gains. Let me just make one other point. For comparative purposes, the losses in the 100 days were greater than the casualties the 1st Canadian Army sustained in Northwest Europe in the 11 months from D-Day to VE Day. The last month of the Great War, in other words, was no walkover, no chasing a beaten enemy out of France and Belgium, and the casualties resulting from open warfare were as high or higher than those from trench fighting. But, as historian Bill Rawling correctly observed, only the ratio between losses and gains changed. Perhaps costly victories were better than costly defeats, much better. Currie, again, had no illusions about the horrors of war. We picture war as a business of banners flying, men smiling, full of animation, guns belching forth, and all that sort of thing. One, somehow or other, gets the impression that there is a great deal of glory and glamour about the battlefield. I never saw any of it. I want you to understand that war is simply the curse of butchery, and men who've gone through it, who have seen war stripped of all its trappings, are the last men that will want to see another war. Currie understood what he and his soldiers had been through. His achievement, the Canadian Corps' achievements, were extraordinary. General Horne, who commanded the 1st Army in which Currie's corps served, actually told the Canadian that the Canadian Corps is perhaps rather apt to take all the credit it can for everything, and to consider that the British Expeditionary Force consists of the Canadian Corps and some other troops. There was a good deal of truth in that. Canadians like to brag. But Currie was unfazed. We took care of 25% of the total German army on the Western Front, he wrote a friend. All are part of 47 divisions, leaving it to the American army, the French army, the Belgian army, and the rest of the British army to look after the balance. Currie, of course, knew that many people in Canada and at the front attacked him as a butcher, a general willing to sacrifice thousands of soldiers to glorify his own reputation. And he knew that many of his soldiers were furious at him for casualties suffered in the last few days of the war. He must have been thinking of the need to make a counter-argument, But in fact, his record, the Corps' brilliant record, required no justification at all. He knew that to beat what historian Jack English called a determined first-class enemy on a decisive front called for hard pounding. And he knew that entailed the loss of life. But he was a careful general, one who never wasted his soldiers' lives. He was no Haig, not one to squander his soldiers for ultimately meaningless territorial objectives. History matters. It makes us who we are as a nation. We need to remember Vimy as a great achievement. But we also need to ensure that victory does not overshadow other greater victories. The 100 Days mattered hugely. They won the war. This nation's soldiers played a huge part in this. And in the centenary years of the First World War, we really must remember our accomplishments, the efforts of our soldiers. Thank you very much.